The wind did not fade in stages, it simply left. One moment the sails held a steady curve against a living push of air, and the next moment they hung as limp as laundry on a line, the canvas losing its shape so gently that you did not notice the change until the sounds of the ship began to alter around you. The high, thin whistle that had sung through the rigging for days softened into nothing, and the creak of the blocks overhead grew less frequent, as if the vessel itself was exhaling after a long effort. You stood on the main deck with your bare feet planted on the warm wood, and you felt the deck stop its slow, regular tilt. The long, rolling heel to starboard that had rocked you to sleep for weeks dissolved into a flat and level stillness. The sea, which had been a field of low, steady swells, flattened by the same invisible hand that had taken the wind, and the ship settled into the water like a spoon coming to rest in a bowl of oil. There was no announcement, no cry of alarm from the watch, because every man aboard had felt this kind of departure before, and they all understood that the ocean had simply decided to pause. The silence that followed was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a great, wide room after a door has been closed, a quiet that seemed to have its own weight and texture. You lifted your eyes to the masts and saw the pennant at the truck hanging straight down, the little triangle of red cloth touching the wood of the topmast, and you knew without needing to be told that the calm had arrived and would be staying for a while. The heat, which had been kept at bay by the moving air, began to settle over the ship like a second blanket laid on top of the first, a thick and drowsy warmth that made the tar in the seams soften and give off a dark, sweet smell. You could feel the sun on your shoulders through the thin linen of your shirt, a steady pressure of light that seemed to push you gently toward the deck, inviting you to sit, to stop, to wait. All around you the crew moved with the same slowed pace, their voices lower than before, their tasks shifting from active sailing to the quiet business of tidying a ship that no longer needed to be worked. The mate, a lean man with a face leathered by salt, walked slowly along the rail and looked out at the water with an expression that held neither worry nor relief, only a kind of patient recognition, and you heard him murmur to the boatswain that the glass was falling only a little, and the sky looked settled for a long spell. You leaned against the pinrail and let your hands rest on the worn wood, noticing the way the grain had been smoothed by years of other hands doing the same thing in other calms, and the thought drifted across your mind like a cloud that this was simply part of the voyage, a quiet room between the busier corridors of wind and weather. The captain, a small man with spectacles and a careful way of moving, appeared on the quarterdeck and studied the horizon through his glass, turning slowly all the way around the compass, and when he lowered the telescope he wrote something in the logbook that he kept under his arm, the scratch of his pen, the only sharp sound in the soft air. You did not know what he wrote, but you imagined it was something simple, a note of the hour and the state of the sky, because there was nothing else to record. The wind had gone, and the ship was no longer traveling, and the only thing to do was to wait and let the hours pass. The morning wore on in this way, the sun climbing higher, and the shadows under the boats and along the bulwarks shrinking into thin dark lines that offered little relief from the brightness. You found yourself listening to the small, intimate noises of the vessel, the ones that were usually covered by the rush of wind and the splash of waves, the faint ticking of the hull as the wood warmed and expanded, the gentle flap of a loose reef point against the belly of a sail, the distant clatter of a pot from the galley where the cook was preparing the noon meal with no urgency at all. A few of the men sat down on the hatch covers and began to mend their clothes with needles and thread, their heads bent low over the work, and the only conversation between them was a slow exchange of words about the last time they had been becalmed, a story you had heard before and would hear again, told in the same unhurried rhythm as the stitching. He walked to the water barrel and lifted the dipper, drinking a small mouthful of warm, slightly brackish water that tasted of the cask, and then you poured a little into your hand and wiped it across the back of your neck, feeling the momentary coolness fade almost instantly into the air. The ocean around the ship had changed its color as the wind died, shifting from a deep running blue to a paler and more glassy shade, so that looking over the side was like looking into a mirror that had been tinted with a wash of sky. There was no reflection of the ship that you could see, only a trembling image of the masts that disappeared when you tried to focus on it, and the water itself seemed to have no depth, as if the keel rested on a floor of solid light only a few feet below. You stood there for a long time watching the surface, and after a while a small translucent creature, no bigger than your thumbnail, pulsed slowly past, its body contracting and expanding with a rhythm that seemed to match the slow beat of your own heart. The calm stretched the minutes into something larger than minutes, each one containing more silence than you were used to, and the ship became a little wooden world that held everything you needed for the time being. The afternoon came without a single cat's paw of wind to ruffle the water, and the sun moved across the sky in a long, slow arc that you could track by the shifting of the shadows on the deck. You took your turn at the wheel, though the wheel was useless now, the rudder drifting without purpose in the still water, and you simply stood with your hands resting on the spokes, feeling the warmth of the wood that had been heated by the sun all day. The ship's head pointed in no particular direction, and the compass needle drifted lazily in its bowl, moving a few degrees one way and then back again, as if it too was dozing. From this position you could see the whole length of the vessel, from the bowsprit to the taffrail, and it struck you how orderly everything was, how every rope was coiled and every block was in its place, a ship waiting with patience for the wind to remember it. The silence was so complete that you could hear a man coughing somewhere below decks, a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the timber, and then you heard the soft pad of bare feet on the ladder as someone came up for air. The day deepened into late afternoon, and the light began to take on a golden quality that made the sails look like parchment, the edges of the canvas glowing against the pale blue of the sky. You left the wheel and joined a group of sailors who were sitting on the forecastle deck, their legs dangling over the side, and you sat among them without speaking, letting your own legs hang down toward the water that was so still you could see the hull reflected in it, the copper sheathing a blurred green band at the waterline. One of the older men, a fellow with grey in his beard and a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm, took out a small piece of whalebone and a knife, and began to carve something, perhaps a new fid or a decorative handle for a sea chest, and the rest of you watched the slow, careful movements of his hands as he shaved thin curls of bone onto the deck. The mood was not sad or anxious, only quiet, the way a household grows quiet in the late hours of the evening when the day's work is done and there is nothing left but to sit and feel the presence of the people around you. You thought about the last time you had seen land, a smudge of green hills on the horizon that had faded into the haze weeks ago, and you tried to picture the fields and the trees that were somewhere over the curve of the sea, but the image would not hold still in your mind, and eventually you let it go and simply looked at the water. The sun began to set without any of the usual fanfare of color, because there were no clouds to catch the light, only a gradual fading from gold to a soft, even grey that spread across the sky like a thin layer of ash. The sails turned from parchment to shadow, their shapes still hanging in the same loose folds they had held all day, and the sea became a sheet of dull pewter that merged with the sky at the horizon so that you could not tell where one ended and the other began. As the light failed, the cook brought out a lantern and hung it from the stay, and the small flame made a warm circle of yellow that pushed back the gathering dusk. The captain walked the deck one more time, his hands clasped behind his back, and he paused to speak with the mate in a voice too low for you to hear, their heads bent close together in the lantern light. You caught a few words, something about the barometer holding steady, and the look of the stars later, but the rest was lost in the soft, still air. The first stars appeared, not one by one but all at once, a dusting of silver points that came out when the sky was still pale enough to hold the last memory of blue. There was no moon yet, and the darkness that filled the spaces between the stars was deep and complete, so that the ship seemed to float in a bowl of night with no connection to anything else. The lantern light picked out the faces of the men around you, half-lit and quiet, their eyes catching the glow as they looked up at the constellations they had known since childhood, the same patterns that had guided sailors across these waters for centuries. You found the North Star easily, a steady point of light that seemed to hang directly above the masthead, and you held your gaze on it for a while, letting the stillness of the heavens settle into your own body. The watch changed, and you were part of the first night watch, that there was nothing to watch for except the unlikely appearance of a breeze that no one expected. You took your place on the foredeck with a rolled-up blanket to sit on, and you listened to the ship breathe around you, the deep, slow groans of the timber as it cooled after the long day of heat. The sound was rhythmic and low, almost like the breathing of a great animal at rest, and it became a kind of companion in the dark, a reminder that the ship was alive in its own way, responding to the temperature and the pressure of the water. You heard the faint splash of a fish jumping somewhere off the beam, a small round sound that vanished immediately into the larger silence, and you imagined the ripples spreading out in perfect circles that would eventually reach the hull and be too small to feel. The hours of the watch passed with no events to mark them, only the slow rotation of the stars overhead as the earth turned beneath the motionless ship. At one point the mate came forward and stood beside you, looking out at the water, and after a long silence he said that in all his years at sea he had never seen a calm so complete, so lacking in any hint of motion. And then he walked away again, leaving you with the sound of his words hanging in the air. You wrapped the blanket around your shoulders against the slight coolness that came with the deep night, and you let your eyes rest on the dark water, not focusing on anything, just receiving the faint shimmer of starlight on the surface that was smoother than any polished stone. The thought came to you that the ship was like a painting of a ship, fixed in a landscape of deep blue and silver, and you were part of the painting, a small figure seated in the foreground with your face turned toward the sea. This idea did not trouble you. It was almost comforting, the notion that nothing was required of you except to remain still and let the picture exist. The night wore on toward the small hours, and your eyelids grew heavy with the same weight that seemed to press down on the whole vessel, a gentle fatigue that came not from work but from the very stillness itself. When your watch was over you went below to your hammock, feeling your way in the dark with the familiarity of long habit, and you lay down in the warm, stuffy air of the berth deck. Around you the other men slept with the deep, regular breathing of those who have no reason to be wakeful, and you let the sound pull you down into sleep, a sleep that was as still and unbroken as the sea outside. The ship rested on the water, and the water rested under the ship, and the whole arrangement drifted without moving, waiting for the wind that would one day return, but that felt very far away just then. The first day of the calm had passed, and it left behind only the quiet memory of itself, a layer of stillness that would build, day by day, into something deeper than any of you yet understood. You woke not to a sound, but to a change in the texture of the darkness, a faint thinning of the blackness behind your eyelids that told you the sun was approaching the horizon somewhere out beyond the still water. In the berth deck, the air was close and warm, carrying the familiar smells of tar, old wood, and the sleeping bodies of 30 men packed into a space meant to hold them like seeds in a pod. Your hammock hung perfectly still, not swaying even a finger's width, and you lay there for a while with your eyes open, but not yet focused, letting the awareness of the new day drift over you in slow waves. The canvas of the hammock was warm where your body had pressed into it all night, and the rope at your feet had grown slack from the heat. Above you, the deck beams were dark with age, their grain running in long straight lines that you had traced with your eyes 100 times before. Someone nearby stirred in his sleep and made a soft sound, a half-word from a dream that would never be remembered, and then the breathing around you settled back into its steady rhythm. The first true light began to creep down through the gratings of the hatch, pale grey streaks that fell across the hammocks and made the dust motes visible as tiny floating points of gold. You swung your legs over the side of the canvas and dropped to the deck, your bare feet meeting the smooth worn planks that had been sanded by decades of other bare feet doing the same thing. The wood was already warm, holding the memory of yesterday's heat through the night, and the warmth climbed up through your soles and into your ankles as you stood there gathering yourself for the day. Around you other men were beginning to stir, their movements slow and unurgent, each one climbing out of his hammock like a swimmer leaving the water. No one spoke much. The first words of the morning were always soft and few, simple greetings that amounted to little more than a nod and a murmur. You made your way to the ladder and climbed up into the open air, and the change was immediate, the light so bright after the dimness below that you had to squint and pause halfway up the ladder until your eyes adjusted. The deck was already warm underfoot, heated by the earliest touch of the sun, and the air on your face was like a soft, damp cloth laid gently over the skin. The sea around the ship was the same glassy sheet it had been the night before, only now it was the color of pale milk, with a faint blush of rose near the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to show itself. The sails still hung in their same loose curves, and the rigging was still silent, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath in exactly the same way it had been holding it for an entire day and night. You walked to the water barrel that stood lashed near the mainmast, its wood dark with dampness where the morning condensation had gathered. The dipper was hanging from its hook, a small wooden bowl with a long handle, worn smooth by countless hands. You lifted it and poured a careful measure of water into your cupped palm, the ration small because no one knew how long the calm would last, and the captain had given quiet orders to be mindful. The water was tepid and tasted faintly of the oak cask, a woody flavor that was not unpleasant once you grew used to it. You splashed the water onto your face and felt it run down your cheeks and into the stubble on your chin, and then you wiped your eyes with the back of your hand and looked again at the sea. The morning routine aboard the ship was a thing of habit so deeply worn into the men that it happened without anyone needing to give orders. You saw the cook, a round-shouldered man with flour on his apron, disappear down the aft hatch toward the galley where the stove would already be warming the small space. The smell of smoke from the chimney reached you a moment later, a thin, acrid scent that mixed with the salt air and promised a hot drink if nothing else. You made your way forward to the head, a small platform that jutted out over the bow, where the men went about their private business with their backs turned to each other out of long-established courtesy. The water below was so clear that you could see the hull curving away beneath you, the copper sheathing a dull green that caught the early light in patches. When you were finished, you returned to the main deck and found that the boatswain had appeared, a stocky man with a voice like gravel rolling in a barrel, and he was assigning the morning chores in the same quiet tone he always used when there was no wind to shout over. The work on a ship without wind was not the work of sailing, it was the work of maintenance, of keeping the vessel tidy and sound while she waited. You were set to coiling ropes that were already coiled, checking the Flemish on the pins and making sure no line had worked loose during the night. You walked along the pin rail and laid your hand on each coil, feeling the dry hemp under your palm, the fibers prickling slightly against your skin. The coils were all tight and even, the work of the day before still holding, and so you simply ran your fingers over them and moved on to the next pin, the task more of a ritual than a necessity. The sun was fully up now, a pale gold disk that had lost its rosy dawn colors and settled into a steady, warm presence above the horizon. The heat began to build, not the sharp, stabbing heat of a desert, but a slow, suffusing warmth that wrapped around you like a second layer of clothing. You could feel your shirt beginning to stick to your back, the linen holding the moisture from your skin, and you adjusted your kerchief around your neck to keep the sun off the exposed skin there. A few of the men had stripped to their waists, their torsos brown and lean from months at sea, and they moved about their tasks with the same slow, deliberate pace that had settled over the ship like a rule. There was no need to hurry, there was no squall to prepare for, no course to steer, no land to sight, only the endless flat water and the endless flat sky, meeting in a circle that never changed. You finished the ropes and moved to the sails, checking the reef points and the gaskets that held the canvas to the yards. The sails were dry and stiff, their edges curling slightly from the heat, and you smoothed them flat with your hand, feeling the tight weave of the cloth under your palm. Above you the mast rose into the pale sky, their tops so far up that you had to tilt your head all the way back to see them, and the trucks at the very top were still and silent against the blue. The morning wore on in this way, the small tasks filling the hours with their small rhythms. At the fourth bell, the cook called up that the breakfast was ready, and the men gathered near the galley hatch with their tin plates and cups. You joined the line and received your portion, a ship's biscuit, hard and pale, and a cup of wheat tea that was more warm water than leaf, but still carried a faint bitterness that woke the mouth. You sat on the hatch cover with your back against the boat skids, and ate the biscuit slowly, breaking off small pieces with your teeth and letting them soften on your tongue before you chewed. The biscuit tasted of flour and salt, and the faintest hint of the barrel it had been stored in. A dry and simple flavor that you had eaten so many times it had become the taste of the sea itself. Around you the other men ate in the same slow way, their jaws working patiently, their eyes looking out at the water or down at their plates. The talk was quiet and loose, a few words about the heat, a half-remembered story about another calm on another voyage, a question about the phase of the moon. The older sailor with the whalebone carving had added a new detail since the day before, a small scroll pattern that ran along the handle of whatever he was making, and he showed it to the man next to him with a quiet pride that needed no boasting. You finished your biscuit and drank the last of the tea, the tin cup warm in your hands, and then you rinsed the cup with a splash of water from your ration and set it aside for the next meal. The morning's work resumed with the same gentle pace, the boatswain finding tasks that needed doing only because the hands needed to be kept busy. You spent an hour with a bucket of soapy water and a stone, scrubbing a section of the deck that was already clean, the wood pale and smooth under the bristles of the brush. The soap made a thin grey lather that spread out in slow circles and then dried almost immediately in the sun, leaving faint white rings that you scrubbed again until they disappeared. The motion of the brush was hypnotic, back and forth, and your mind drifted away from your body and floated somewhere above the ship, looking down at the little wooden vessel in the great blue circle of the sea. You thought about the land again, the green hills and the fields, but the image was harder to hold now than it had been the day before, the memory fading like the soap suds on the deck. When the scrubbing was done, you helped the sailmaker repair a small tear in one of the staysails, sitting cross-legged on the deck with a needle and waxed thread, while the old man held the canvas flat for you. The needle pushed through the heavy cloth with a satisfying resistance, and you pulled the thread tight and made another stitch, the work as regular as breathing. The sailmaker had hands that were twisted with age, but still steady, his fingers guiding the fabric without seeming to need any direction from his eyes. He told you a long, rambling story about a storm he had weathered off the Horn 40 years before, but he told it in the same calm voice he would have used to describe the weather today. And the story had no climax, only a slow progression of details about waves and wind and the color of the sky. You listened with half your attention and let the rest of your mind stay quiet, the way you would listen to a stream running over stones. By the time the sail was mended, the sun was directly overhead, and the shadows had shrunk to small dark pools directly under the boats and the bulwarks. The heat had become a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on your head and shoulders and made the air shimmer above the deck. The tar in the seams between the planks had softened and was giving off that sweet, dark smell that you had noticed the day before, and it mixed with the salt of the sea and the faint smoke from the galley to make a scent that was the scent of the calm itself. The cook called the noon meal, and the men gathered again with their plates, this time receiving a ladle of peas porridge and a small piece of salt pork that had been boiled until it was pale and soft. You ate standing up this time, leaning against the rail and looking out at the water while you spooned the porridge into your mouth. The peas were mushy and warm, and the pork was salty enough to make your lips tingle, and you chewed each mouthful thoroughly because there was no reason to hurry. After the meal, most of the men found patches of shade and settled into them like cats, their bodies going still and their eyes half closing against the brightness. You found a spot under the overhang of the quarterdeck, a narrow strip of shadow that was just wide enough to sit in, and you leaned your head back against the bulkhead and let your breathing slow. The ship creaked around you, a long, slow groan that traveled through the timber like a sigh, and somewhere above you a rope tapped against the mast with a soft, regular tick that counted out the seconds. The afternoon stretched ahead of you in a long, unbroken line, the hours indistinguishable from one another, the heat and the light and the silence all blending together into a single continuous experience of waiting. You did not sleep, but you rested in a way that was deeper than simple waking, a state of suspension where your thoughts became slow and distant, like clouds moving across a sky that was too wide to cross in a day. The men around you were doing the same thing, their bodies arranged in the shapes of rest, their faces slack and peaceful. One man was mending a shirt with slow, careful stitches, his needle flashing in the sun each time it broke the surface of the cloth. Another was running a whetstone along the edge of his knife, the sound a steady hiss that added to the texture of the afternoon. The world had shrunk to the size of the ship, and the ship had become a small, self-contained universe with its own rhythms and its own rules. And you were a part of it, in the same way that the masts and the sails and the sea itself were a part of it. The sun began its slow descent toward the west, and the shadows grew longer by imperceptible degrees, and the quality of the light changed from white to gold. The heat eased just a little, the way it always did in the late afternoon, and a few of the men stirred and rose to stretch their limbs before the evening routine began. You stood up too, feeling the stiffness in your back and the pleasant ache of a day spent doing very little, and you walked to the rail to look at the water one more time before the light failed. The sea was exactly the same as it had been in the morning, smooth and pale and empty, and the horizon was a clean line drawn all the way around the world. You stayed there until the sun touched the edge of the sea, and then you turned away and prepared yourself for another night, another watch, another stretch of hours in the quiet dark. The morning had been full of small things, and the afternoon had been full of stillness, and the evening would be full of stars, and the ship would wait through all of it, patient as a stone on the bottom of the ocean. You found a place to sit on the foredeck where the anchor cable lay coiled in a great flat spiral, and you lowered yourself onto the warm hemp with your back resting against the windless barrel. The position gave you a view of the whole length of the ship, from the bowsprit stretching out over the glassy water to the aftercastle rising gently at the stern. There was no work to do just then, and the morning had settled into that long, quiet pause between breakfast and the small duties that would fill the later hours. The stillness of the air was so complete that you could hear your own breathing, a soft rise and fall that blended into the larger silence, and you closed your mouth and breathed through your nose so that the sound would not distract you from the other sounds, the ones the ship was making all by itself. A wooden vessel at rest is never truly silent. It speaks in a low, private voice that only those who live aboard can hear, a language of small creaks and ticks and sighs that form the background of every day. You sat and let these sounds come to you, not straining to catch them but simply receiving them as they drifted through the warm air, each one distinct and unhurried. The first sound you noticed was the gentle expansion of the deck planks under the climbing sun, a series of soft, irregular clicks that traveled along the length of the ship like the popping of tiny seeds. The wood had cooled during the night, contracting just enough to loosen the seams, and now the heat was coaxing the fibers to swell again, the timbers pressing against one another with a sound that was half a creak and half a sigh. You could feel the same expansion through the soles of your feet, a faint vibration that came up through the hemp and into your bones. The ship stretching itself awake after the long night. Nearby, a block that hung from the foremast stay swung almost imperceptibly, even though there was no wind to move it. Its pivot was so well greased that the motion produced no sound, but the strop that held the block to the stay was dry and old, and it gave a single high, thin squeak every few minutes as the fibers adjusted to the temperature. The sound was so faint that you lost it whenever a larger noise occurred, but in the silences between it returned, a tiny voice that seemed to be speaking to no one. From the mainmast, a loose reef point, a short length of rope left untucked the day before, tapped against the canvas of the mainsail with a rhythm that had no pattern. Now 2 quick taps, now a long pause, now a single soft stroke, like a finger brushing a drumhead. The air was so still that the rope must have been moved by the heat itself, the threads twisting and untwisting as the sun warmed them, and you watched it for a while and let its irregular beat mark the passing of the minutes. Beneath all these surface noises there was a deeper sound, a long, slow groan that seemed to come from the very heart of the ship, the massive keelson and the heavy frames adjusting to the pressure of the water that held them. This groan would start low and build almost imperceptibly, then fade away into the background, only to return a quarter of an hour later from a different part of the hull, as if the ship were conversing with the sea in a voice too deep for human ears to translate. You had heard this sound many times before, but only now, in the absolute quiet of the calm, could you follow its full arc from beginning to end, and you found yourself waiting for it like a listener at a concert, waiting for the cello to speak. The galley chimney added its own note to the morning, a faint metallic pinging as the sheet of iron expanded against its brackets, and from the open hatch, the cook's voice floated up in a tuneless hum that was half song and half murmur. The clink of a tin pot against the stove grate came clearly across the deck, a bright, domestic sound that seemed out of place in the vast emptiness of the ocean, and a moment later the smell of boiling water reached your nose, the steam drifting out and mingling with the salt air. You could hear the cook moving about his small kingdom, the scuff of his feet on the brick hearth, the rattle of a ladle, the soft hiss of water spilling onto hot iron, and these noises were so ordinary, so familiar, that they made the rest of the world seem very far away. Somewhere behind you on the main deck, a man was scraping the last of the morning's grease from his plate with a piece of biscuit, the sound of quiet scratching that was followed by the clatter of the tin plate being set down on the hatch cover. Another man was mending a pair of trousers with long, even stitches, and you could hear the thread pulling through the heavy cloth with a whispered zip that repeated every few seconds, a patient, steady sound that seemed to stretch out the morning into an endless ribbon of time. The voices of the men were low and lazy, not the quick speech of work, but the slow, drifting talk of men who had all day to say what they wanted to say. You caught fragments of a conversation about the best way to cook salt fish, one man insisting that soaking it in fresh water overnight was the secret, while the other argued for a second, boiling with a bay leaf, and their words wandered off into silence without reaching any conclusion, leaving only the soft chuckle of the older sailor who had been listening. The water around the hull made almost no sound at all, because there were no waves to slap against the planks. But if you listened very carefully, you could hear the tiniest lapping noise where the copper sheathing met the surface. A sound so faint, it was more like a memory of water than the water itself. Occasionally, a small bubble of air trapped somewhere under the hull would release itself and rise to the surface with a low liquid pop, and you would turn your head toward the sound and watch the ripples spread out in perfect rings that grew wider and flatter until they disappeared. The ship's bell hung from the gallows near the foremast, and though no one had touched it, the bell made a soft humming tone whenever a particular set of vibrations ran through the wood, the metal stirring in its bracket just enough to sing for a moment before falling silent again. You let your eyes rest on the bell, watching the way the light played on its polished bronze surface, and you listened for the next hum, which came after many minutes and was so quiet that you were not sure you had heard it at all. A fly that had come aboard days ago and survived the empty sea buzzed past your ear and settled on the pinrail, its tiny body a dark speck against the pale wood, and the sound of its wings was a thin, reedy drone that rose and fell as it cleaned its legs with quick, jerky movements. You watched the fly without moving, and the drone of its wings became part of the tapestry of sound, another thread in the fabric of the morning. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows shrank, and the sounds of the ship changed slightly in response, the creaking of the deck becoming more frequent as the heat intensified, the groan of the hull deepening as the water warmed the outside of the planks, while the inside remained cool from the night. You could hear the difference if you paid attention. The morning creaks had been light and irregular, like the first stirrings of a household, while the midday creaks were longer and more insistent, the wood fully awake and stretching with purpose. You shifted your weight on the anchor cable, and the hemp fibers rustled against one another, a dry, papery sound that reminded you of leaves stirring on a forest floor, and you stilled yourself again so that you would not miss any of the ship's own voice. From the aftercastle you heard the captain's cabin door open and close, the click of the latch distinct against the softer background, and then the sound of his boots on the companionway ladder, each step a solid, measured thump that seemed to count out a rhythm as regular as a metronome. He walked across the quarterdeck and stopped at the rail, and you heard the faint creak of his hand on the wood as he leaned out to study the horizon, though there was nothing there to see, and after a few moments he walked back the way he had come, the boots retracing their steps in reverse order. The ship's cat, a lean orange creature that had been aboard longer than most of the crew, padded silently across the deck on its soft paws and then, for no reason you could determine, began to purr loudly as it rubbed its cheek against a coil of rope. The purring was a low, mechanical sound that vibrated in the air like a tiny engine, and the cat kept it up for a long time, its eyes half closed in contentment, adding a layer of warmth to the auditory landscape. You closed your own eyes for a while and simply let the sounds wash over you, the way you might listen to rain falling on a roof or a fire crackling in a hearth. Without sight to distract you, the sounds became more distinct, each one carving out its own space in the air. You could hear the distant murmur of the men more clearly now, the voices separating into individual threads, the low rumble of the bosun explaining something to a younger sailor, the higher, nasal tone of the carpenter's mate describing a joint he intended to make, the soft, rhythmic chanting of a man reciting a psalm under his breath as he worked. The clink of the cook's ladle came again, and this time it was followed by the scrape of a knife on a chopping board, a steady chop 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 that spoke of vegetables being reduced to small pieces for the noon stew. The sound of the knife was soothing in its regularity, a slow, deliberate beat that gave structure to the formless silence, and you let your mind follow it like a path through a quiet wood. A bird appeared from somewhere, a small dark shape that must have been blown off course weeks ago and had been resting on the ship ever since, and it let out a single thin cheep as it hopped along the bulwark. The sound was so unexpected, so sharp against the blur of ship noises, that it opened your eyes and you watched the bird preen its wing feathers with quick, precise movements of its beak, each feather making a soft clicking sound as it was drawn through the bill. The bird finished its grooming and fluttered up to the mizzen yard, its wings making a dry, rustling flutter that sounded like a deck of cards being shuffled, and then it settled and was silent. The afternoon came on, and the heat pressed down harder, and the sounds of the ship seemed to slow even further, as if the warmth itself was damping the vibrations. The creaks grew less frequent, the groans deeper and more spaced apart, and the voices of the men faded as they retreated into the shade for their midday rest. You could hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sailor sleeping nearest to you, a deep in and out that was punctuated by the occasional soft snore, a sound that started as a low rumble and ended with a slight whistle. The sleeping man shifted, and his shirt rustled against the deck, and then he was still again, and the snoring stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was the deepest you had experienced yet, a silence so complete that you could hear the blood moving in your own ears. A faint, distant rushing that was not a sound of the ship, but a sound of yourself, the inner ocean that you carried with you everywhere. In this deep silence, a single drop of moisture fell from the mainyard onto the deck, a leftover from the heavy dew of the night that had collected in a fold of the sail and now, warmed by the sun, had let go. The drop hit the plank with a sound so small it was barely a tick, a wet kiss of water on wood, and then it was gone, absorbed into the grain or evaporated into the air before you could even locate the spot. You thought about all the other sounds you were not hearing, the sounds that had been part of your life before the calm. The rush of wind past your ears, the hiss of the sea parting at the bow, the snap of the sails when the breeze freshened, the groan of the rigging under a strong press of canvas. Those sounds were stored in your memory, and you could call them up if you wanted to, but you found that you did not want to. The quiet was enough. The small voices of the idle ship were company enough for this long, slow afternoon. A rope creaked in its block, the same dry strop you had heard earlier, and the sound seemed to mark the passage of a full hour since you had first sat down. The shadow of the foremast had moved across the deck, and the patch of shade you had chosen was now a patch of sun, and so you rose slowly, your legs stiff from sitting, and you moved to a new spot near the cathead where the shade was deeper. As you settled again, you heard a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from deep inside the ship, and you realized it was the sound of the carpenter using a mallet far below in the hold, perhaps knocking a loose wedge back into place or tapping a cask to see if it was full. The thump was regular and muffled, like a heart beating inside a wooden chest, and it went on for a long time, 10 thumps, 20 thumps, 30 thumps before stopping, and the silence that rushed in after it was almost a sound in itself. The afternoon light began to slant, and the quality of the sounds changed once more, the creaks becoming less frequent as the wood cooled just slightly, the groans rising in pitch as the fibers tightened. You heard the cook's boy come up on deck with a bucket and a rope, and the splash of the bucket hitting the water was a soft, hollow plunk that sent small ripples out across the glassy surface. The boy hauled the bucket up and poured the water into the scuttlebutt, the liquid gurgling and glugging as it found its level, and then he went below again, leaving the deck to the silence and the creeping shadows. The fly buzzed past you once more, and you heard the cat's purr resume somewhere behind you, and the ship's bell hummed its quiet, accidental note, and the whole collection of small sounds seemed to weave together into a single, gentle fabric that wrapped the ship and held it suspended in the warm, still air. You let your mind drift on this fabric, not thinking about anything in particular, just floating on the surface of the sounds the way the ship floated on the surface of the sea, and the boundary between your own listening and the sounds themselves grew thin and soft. The day would end soon, and the night sounds would be different, the creaks sharper in the cooler air, the stars silent, but somehow loud in their number, the breath of the sleeping crew, the only music left. For now, though, you sat and listened, and the ship spoke to you in its quiet, private voice, and you understood that this was the true language of the calm, a language that said nothing and everything all at once. The boatswain stood near the mainmast with his hands on his hips and his head tilted back, studying the rigging the way a man might study a half-finished letter, searching for something that needed attention. The morning sun had already warmed the deck to a pleasant temperature, and the men had gathered in a loose group near the pinrail, waiting without impatience for the day's tasks to be assigned. There was no wind to harness, no course to steer, no sails to trim, and so the work would be the work of the idle ship, the small endless maintenance that kept a wooden vessel sound through the long empty days of a calm. The boatswain lowered his gaze and ran his tongue over his teeth, a habit he had when he was thinking, and then he began to speak in his low, rumbling voice, giving out assignments, the way a farmer might hand out tools before a day in the fields. You were told to take a bucket of Stockholm tar and a brush and go over the standing rigging from the foremast shrouds to the mainmast backstays, putting a thin coat on any part of the rope that looked dry or worn. The tar was thick and dark, it smelled sharp and medicinal, and as you carried the bucket forward, the odor rose up around you and filled your nose until you could taste it at the back of your throat. You set the bucket down at the base of the foremast and dipped the brush into the warm, sticky liquid, letting the excess drip back into the bucket before you raised the brush to the first shroud. The rope was made of 4 thick strands twisted around a heart, its surface rough with age and salt, and the tar soaked into the fibers with a soft sucking sound, darkening the hemp from a dry tan to a deep wet brown. You worked the brush in long, slow strokes, moving from the D-die upward as far as you could reach, and then you climbed a few feet up the ratlines and did the next section, and then the next, each stroke of the brush covering about a hand's width of rope. The motion was simple and repetitive. Dip the brush, lift it, stroke the rope, dip again, and your mind began to settle into the rhythm of it, the way a boat settles into a gentle swell. The sun on your back was warm but not yet hot, and the tar glistened as you spread it, catching the light in a way that made the rope look wet and new. You could hear the other men at their own tasks around you, the scrape of a scraper on the deck where someone was removing old cracked caulking from a seam, the soft thump of a wooden mallet as the carpenter's mate tapped a tree nail into a new section of the bulwark, the hiss of a whetstone as a man sharpened the tools that would be used later in the day. The sounds blended together into a kind of work song, a low, steady music that accompanied your own labor and made the morning pass without any sense of hurry. When you finished the foremast shrouds, you moved to the mainmast, carrying the bucket carefully across the deck so that no tar spilled onto the clean planks. The mainmast was thicker and taller than the foremast, and its rigging was more complex, with multiple sets of shrouds and backstays that fanned out like the ribs of a great umbrella. You started at the forward starboard shroud and worked your way aft, brushing the tar into each rope with the same slow, deliberate strokes, and as you worked, you began to notice the small differences between the ropes. The way this one was slightly more worn from the chafe of a block, that one still almost new and tight in its lay. The tar itself was a living thing, changing its consistency as the sun warmed it, growing thinner and easier to spread, and by the time you reached the mizzen mast it was running off the brush in thin, glossy streams that covered the rope with a smooth, even coat. The smell of it had settled into your clothes and your skin, and you knew it would be with you for days, a dark, sweet scent that would remind you of this morning whenever you caught it on your sleeve. While you worked on the rigging, another group of men had been set to picking oakum from the old seams of the deck, a task that required them to sit on the planks with a bent piece of iron and a mallet, digging out the dried, crumbling caulking that had lost its seal. The sound of their work was a steady tap-tap scrape that echoed across the deck, and they spoke to each other in low voices as they worked, their conversation wandering from topic to topic, like a slow river finding its way to the sea. You heard one man telling another about a ship he had served on that had a figurehead of a woman with a golden crown, and the other man replied that he had seen a figurehead once that was a serpent with scales painted green, and they compared the two for a while without ever reaching any conclusion about which was finer. The talk was easy and loose, the kind of talk that filled the time without demanding any great attention, and it rose and fell against the background of the tapping mallets like a thread running through a piece of cloth. The sun climbed higher, and the heat grew stronger, and the boatswain called for a pause, so that the men could drink from the scuttlebutt and rest their hands for a few minutes. You set down your brush and bucket, and joined the line at the water barrel, and when your turn came, you drank deeply from the dipper, the water warm but still refreshing as it washed the taste of tar from your mouth. You poured a little water over your hands and rubbed them together, but the tar was stubborn and would not come off completely, leaving dark stains in the creases of your knuckles that you would carry with you for the rest of the day. After the water break, the boatswain reassigned some of the men to new tasks, and you were sent to help the carpenter's mate with the inspection of the blocks and pulleys that hung throughout the rigging. The two of you climbed the ratlines with a small bag of tools and a pot of grease, and you went from block to block, checking each one to see if the sheave turned freely and if the pin was still tight in its housing. Most of the blocks were in good condition, their wooden shells smooth and dark with age, their sheaves turning with a quiet, well-oiled hum when you spun them with your finger. A few were stiff, their bearings dry from the long weeks at sea, and you took these apart carefully, laying out the pieces on the deck of the top platform where you were working, so that you would not lose any of them over the side. The carpenter's maid showed you how to clean the old grease from the pin with a rag, and how to apply fresh grease from the pot, a thick, pale substance that smelled of animal fat and linseed oil. You worked the grease into the bearing with your thumb, feeling the smooth, slick texture of it, and then you reassembled the block and spun the sheave again to make sure it moved without resistance. The work was delicate and required a certain amount of patience because the parts were small and the height was considerable, the deck far below looking like a toy ship laid out on a sheet of blue glass. The breeze that was not a breeze moved past your face as you worked, not a wind, but a subtle movement of the air caused by the heating of the mast, and it carried the smell of the grease and the tar and the salt all mixed together into a single, complex scent that was the scent of the ship at rest. When the blocks were done, you climbed down to the deck and found that the afternoon had arrived without your noticing it, the sun now past its zenith and the shadows beginning to lengthen again. The cook had set out the noon meal, and the men gathered as they always did, their work pausing for the slow ritual of eating. You took your share of the food and sat on the hatch cover with your back against the boat skids, and you ate in the same slow, methodical way that you had worked, chewing each mouthful of salt fish and hard bread until it was soft enough to swallow. The fish was dry and intensely salty, and it made you thirsty, but you held off on drinking your full water ration until the meal was done, knowing that the water had to last. Around you the men were quiet, their energy spent on the morning's labor, and even the talk was less now, just a few murmured words about the heat or the state of a particular tool that needed mending. The fly that had been aboard for days buzzed lazily past and landed on the rim of your plate, and you waved it away gently, not wanting to disturb the stillness that had settled over the group. After the meal, The boatswain walked among the men and checked the progress of the morning's work, running his hand over the newly tarred rigging and nodding to himself, squatting down to examine the caulking that had been picked from the seams, and telling one of the men to go a little deeper in the aft section, where the water had been seeping during the last rain. You were given a new task, this one requiring you to take a piece of sandstone and a bucket of water and polish the brass of the ship's bell and the compass binnacle and the captain's speaking trumpet that hung on a hook near the wheel. The brass was already smooth and bright, but the salt air was always working on it, dulling the surface with a thin, invisible film of corrosion that only showed itself when you looked closely. You wet the sandstone and began to rub it in small circles over the bell's surface, and the metal responded immediately, the dull spots vanishing and the bright golden shine emerging from beneath the stone. The sound of the stone on the brass was a soft, wet hiss that blended with the other sounds of the afternoon, and you worked your way around the bell's circumference, polishing every inch of it until you could see your own reflection in the curved surface, your face distorted and warm-colored like a portrait painted on a coin. You moved on to the binnacle, the wooden housing that held the compass, and you polished its brass fittings one by one, the hinges and the latch and the small plate that bore the maker's name, each piece growing brighter under your hand. The speaking trumpet was the last piece, its long flared shape, awkward to hold while you polished, but you worked the stone into every crevice and along every edge until the entire instrument gleamed in the afternoon light. When you were finished, you stepped back and looked at your work, and the three brass objects glowed against the muted tones of the wood and the canvas, small suns that you had uncovered from beneath a thin layer of time. The afternoon wore on, and you returned to the boatswain for another task, and this time he handed you a pot of linseed oil and a rag and told you to oil the wooden parts of the ship's wheel, the spokes and the hub, and the king's spoke that was marked with a carved groove so the helmsman could feel it in the dark. You sat down on the deck next to the wheel and dipped the rag into the oil, and you began to rub the oil into the wood with long, slow strokes that followed the grain. The wood was a dark, heavy timber, probably mahogany or something like it, and it drank the oil eagerly, the surface darkening and taking on a soft, rich sheen that made the grain stand out in flowing lines. The smell of the linseed oil was mild and nutty, a pleasant smell that was different from the sharpness of the tar, and it reminded you of the furniture in a quiet house, a parlor somewhere on land where the floors were polished and the windows looked out onto a garden. You worked the oil into every spoke, turning the wheel slowly as you went so that you could reach all the surfaces, and the wheel turned without sound, its bearings well greased from the morning's work on the blocks. The king's spoke came under your hand, and you traced the carved groove with your oiled rag, feeling the smooth indentation that generations of helmsmen had felt before you, and you wondered how many hands had held this same spoke, how many watches had been steered through storms and calms with this same wheel as the point of connection between the sailor and the sea. The afternoon light began to take on that golden quality that signaled the approach of evening, and the boatswain warped the deck one more time and then told the men to put away their tools and wash up for the evening meal. You gathered the brushes and the oil pot and the sandstone and returned them to their proper places in the locker near the foremast, and then you went to the water barrel and washed your hands as best you could, scrubbing at the tar stains with a bit of sand until your skin was raw but still slightly marked. The other men were doing the same, their faces tired but peaceful, their movements slow with the satisfying weariness that comes from a day of small, steady work. You looked around the ship and saw the results of the day's labor in the glossy rigging and the polished brass and the clean-swept deck, and you felt the quiet pride that a craftsman feels when his work is done. Not a loud pride, but a deep, settled sense of having contributed to the vessel that carried you. The evening meal was simple, a stew of dried peas and a scrap of bacon that the cook had been simmering all afternoon, and you ate it slowly, tasting the smoky flavor of the bacon and the earthy sweetness of the peas. The men talked quietly among themselves, their voices softer than they had been in the morning, and the ship creaked around you in its familiar voice, the timbers cooling now and making the small, sharp sounds of contraction after the heat of the day. When the meal was done, you sat on the deck and watched the sunset for the fourth time since the wind had died, and you thought about the work you would do tomorrow, the tasks that would fill the hours and keep the ship alive while it waited. The calm had become a kind of house that you all lived in together, and the chores were the routines that kept the house in order, and there was a comfort in that, a sense that even in the middle of an empty ocean, with no wind to push you forward, there was still a purpose to each day. You leaned your head back against the bulwark and closed your eyes, and the smell of tar and linseed oil rose from your hands and your clothes, a reminder of the day that was ending, and you let the quiet sounds of the evening wash over you as the stars began to come out one by one in the darkening sky. The ocean around the ship had become something more than water. It had become a lens, a great flat pane of clarity that let you see into depths that were usually hidden by the movement of waves and the scatter of light. You stood at the rail near the forechains with your forearms resting on the warm wood, and you looked down into a blue so pure and so deep that your eyes could not find the bottom of it. The water was not the color of shallow seas or the greenish gray of coastal waters. It was a profound indigo that shaded into cobalt and then into a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the sunlight before it could reach whatever lay beneath. The surface itself was a mirror that held the sky, but the mirror was not perfect because the stillness was broken every now and then by the faintest tremor, a shiver that passed across the water like a breath across glass. Too small to call a ripple, but enough to remind you that the sea was still a liquid and not a solid. You had been watching the water for the better part of an hour, and the watching had become a kind of trance, a state in which your thoughts had slowed to the pace of the small things that drifted past the hull. The morning was well advanced by now, the sun high enough to beat straight down into the water and illuminate whatever floated beneath the surface. You could see the great curved flank of the ship's hull descending away from you, the copper sheathing a mottled green that faded into the blue, and below that, the dark shape of the keel that seemed to hang suspended over an infinite emptiness. Tiny bubbles clung to the copper in places, remnants of some slow chemical exchange between the metal and the sea, and they glinted like beads of mercury when the light caught them. A few of the other men had joined you at the rail, drawn by the same quiet fascination, and they stood or squatted along the bulwark with their eyes fixed on the water, speaking only rarely and in low tones. One of them was the old sailor with the anchor tattoo, and he had taken off his kerchief and was using it to wipe the sweat from his neck while he stared down into the depths. Another was a young man who had only been at sea for a year, and he kept pointing at things and then lowering his hand, as if he had remembered that there was no need to point because everyone was already looking at the same thing. The first object of interest that morning was a piece of driftwood that had floated up alongside the ship some time during the night, a grey, weathered branch about the length of your arm that was so waterlogged it rode very low in the water, barely breaking the surface. The wood was smooth and rounded by years of immersion, its bark long since worn away, and it turned slowly in place as you watched, rotating with a stately, patient motion that had no cause you could determine. Perhaps there was a tiny current deep down that you could not feel from the deck, or perhaps the branch was simply responding to the ship's own minute movements, the almost imperceptible drift of the hull through the still water. The driftwood had brought with it a small community of barnacles that clung to one end of the branch, their tiny shells opening and closing with a rhythm so slow it was almost impossible to detect unless you watched for many minutes without looking away. Each barnacle extended its feathery cirri into the water and then withdrew them, a soft, delicate movement that was the only sign of life on the otherwise dead piece of timber. You wondered where the branch had come from, what tree it had once been part of, what shore it had fallen from, and the wondering was a pleasant empty exercise because there was no way to know the answer and no need to find it. The old sailor spoke without turning his head, saying that he had seen driftwood like that come all the way from the coast of Africa, carried by currents that ran deep and slow beneath the surface. And the young sailor asked how long it took to travel so far, and the old man shrugged and said that time moved differently underwater. After the driftwood had drifted past the stern and was no longer visible, the water returned to its empty, glassy stillness for a long while. You shifted your weight from one foot to the other and let your eyes go slightly out of focus so that the surface became a wash of blue without detail, and in this softened gaze you began to notice the subtle variations in the color of the sea, the way it was slightly paler near the hull, where the light reflected off the copper, slightly darker off to starboard, where a thin haze of high cloud was dimming the sun. The heat pressed down on the back of your neck and made the skin there feel tight and warm, and you reached up to adjust your kerchief so that it covered more of the exposed skin. The man next to you, a sailor from the north with pale hair and a reddened face, had given up on covering his skin and was simply letting the sun burn him. His arms and shoulders a deep, angry pink that would eventually turn brown if the voyage lasted long enough. He was watching the water with the same quiet attention as the rest of you, his chin resting on his folded arms, and after a while he murmured that there was something coming, something small and pale, and you all shifted your gaze to where he was looking. The something resolved itself into a cluster of seaweed that was drifting slowly toward the ship from the east, a tangled mass of brown and gold that spread out across the surface like a small floating garden. The seaweed was a kind you had seen before, a sargassum weed that grew in great floating mats far out at sea, and as it came closer you could see the individual fronds and bladders that kept it afloat, the little air sacs like tiny berries that clustered along the stems. The weed was not alone. It carried with it a whole tiny world of creatures that had made their home in its drifting branches. Small, translucent shrimp clung to the stems, their bodies so clear that you could see the tiny organs working inside them, and a few slender fish no longer than your finger darted in and out of the weed, their sides flashing silver when the light hit them. A tiny crab, its shell the exact color of the seaweed, scuttled along a frond and then froze, as if it sensed the great shadow of the ship passing overhead. The whole assembly drifted alongside the hull for a time, moving at the same slow pace as the ship, and you could have reached down and touched it if you'd wanted to. But you did not. You simply watched it, letting the small drama of its arrival and departure fill your mind with its gentle, unurgent life. The seaweed drifted on past the bow and began to fall behind, its golden fronds still visible for a long time against the blue, growing smaller and smaller until they were just a speck on the surface, and then nothing at all. The sea was empty again, and the silence closed back over the ship like water filling a hole. You stayed at the rail, and the other men stayed too, because there was nothing else to do, and the watching had become its own kind of occupation, a way of passing the hours that felt both restful and purposeful. The sun moved higher and the light grew harsher, and the surface of the water began to take on a slight oily sheen, a thin film of something that might have been the residue of distant fish or the natural oils released by the seaweed. The film spread out in patches that were slightly darker than the surrounding water, and they caught the light in a way that made rainbows appear at their edges, faint iridescent rings that shimmered and disappeared as you watched. The young sailor said that it looked like a window into another world, and the old sailor grunted and said that it was just fish oil, but his tone was not dismissive, only stating a fact, and he continued to stare at the rainbows with the same quiet fascination as the rest of you. The afternoon deepened and the heat grew more intense, and a few of the men drifted away to find shade or water, but you remained at the rail with 2 or 3 others, your eyes still on the water, your mind still open to whatever small thing might appear next. What appeared next was a creature so delicate and strange that at first you thought your eyes were playing tricks on you, a tiny pulsing bell of crystal that rose up from the depths and hung suspended just beneath the surface. It was a jellyfish no bigger than your thumbnail, its body a perfect dome of transparent jelly with a faint pink center that throbbed with a slow, steady beat. The bell contracted and the creature rose slightly, then relaxed and began to sink, and then contracted again, over and over, a tiny engine of life that asked nothing of the world except to be allowed to pulse in the warm, still water. More of them appeared as you watched, a whole fleet of tiny jellyfish that had drifted up from the deep, and they dotted the surface around the ship like a scattering of pale flowers. The old sailors said that they always came up during a long calm, because the still water let them float without being torn apart by waves, and the young sailor asked if they would sting, and the old man shook his head and said that these were too small to sting, that they were just mouths and bells and nothing more. You watched the jellyfish for a long time, your eyes moving from one to the next as they rose and sank in their gentle, aimless dance. And you felt a kind of kinship with them, these small, drifting lives that were also waiting, also suspended, also passing the hours with the only motion they knew how to make. The sun began its slow descent toward the west, and the light took on that golden quality that made the water look thicker and richer, like a sheet of amber spread out to the horizon. The jellyfish were still there, their pink centers glowing like tiny coals in the deepening light, and a few more had joined them, larger ones this time, that trailed fine thread-like tentacles behind them as they pulsed through the water. You could see the tentacles clearly through the still surface, their strands so fine they were almost invisible, except when the light caught them at a certain angle and they gleamed like spun glass. The jellyfish drifted away as the sun sank lower, sinking back into the depths from which they had come, and by the time the first stars were beginning to appear, the water was empty again, a clean, unbroken sheet of darkening blue that reflected nothing and held nothing and gave no sign of the life that moved beneath it. You straightened up from the rail, feeling the stiffness in your back and the pleasant ache of a day spent standing still, and you looked around at the ship that had become your whole world. The masts were dark against the pale sky, and the sails were still hanging in their loose folds, and the other men were settling into their evening routines, their voices low and easy as they talked about the things they had seen in the water. You carried with you the images of the day, the driftwood and the seaweed, and the tiny pulsing jellyfish, and they stayed in your mind like a collection of small, quiet paintings that you could look at whenever you closed your eyes. The sea had shown you its face, and the face was deep and clear, and full of small, patient lives, and you understood that the calm was not an emptiness, but a fullness of a different kind, a richness that revealed itself only to those who had the time to stand and watch and wait. You walked slowly aft toward the quarterdeck, and the last light of the day was a soft, grey glow on the water, and the ship rested on the glassy surface like a hand resting on a table, still and patient and waiting for nothing in particular. The afternoon had dissolved into evening so gradually that you could not point to the moment when the day ended and the night began. The light simply leaked out of the sky like water from a slow crack in a barrel, leaving behind a deep violet stain that spread from the horizon upward until it covered everything. You had eaten your evening meal in the same quiet way you had eaten every meal since the wind died. Sitting on the deck with your back against something solid while the taste of salted meat and hard bread faded from your tongue. The men around you had grown quieter as the darkness gathered, their voices dropping into murmurs and then into silence, as if the night itself demanded a certain reverence. The ship had become a collection of soft shadows and darker shapes, the masts disappearing into the gloom overhead and the sails blending into the general blackness until you could not tell where canvas ended and sky began. Somewhere forward the ship's bell rang out, the change of watch, 2 bells in the second dog watch, and the sound was clear and round in the still air, a single note that hung for a moment and then dissolved into the larger quiet. You were on the first night watch, the watch that ran from 8 in the evening until midnight, and you rose from your place on the hatch cover and made your way aft to relieve the man who had been standing at the useless wheel. The deck was warm under your bare feet, still holding the memory of the sun, even hours after it had set, and the planks were smooth as bone, worn to a polish by decades of other bare feet making the same short journey. The man at the wheel was a shadow among shadows, his face invisible under the brim of his hat, and he handed over the watch with a few soft words, nothing that needed to be reported because nothing had happened, and nothing would happen, just the ritual phrase that the watch was yours, and the ship was still, and the sea was calm. You took your place at the wheel and let your hands rest on the spokes, the wood cool now against your palms, and you looked out over the deck and the dark water beyond. The ship was a world of quiet activity, even in the darkness, the kind of activity that was too small to call activity, just the slow movements of the other watch members as they settled into their positions. 3 other men shared this watch with you, and they were spaced around the deck like sentinels at a gate that no one would ever approach, one forward near the bow, one amidships by the mainmast, one aft on the poop deck, and you at the wheel. They did not pace or march. They simply found places to sit or lean, and then stayed there, their eyes turned outward toward the invisible horizon, or upward toward the sky that was now revealing its full wealth of stars. The stars had come out not one by one, but in a slow, silent flood, the way water rises in a pool, and by the time the last of the twilight had drained away, they were so thick and so bright that you could not find the familiar constellations without searching. The Milky Way was a broad river of pale light that stretched from one side of the horizon to the other, its edges soft and indistinct, and within its current were thousands of smaller stars that your eye could only see if you did not look directly at them. The old sailor had told you once that the best way to see a faint star was to look slightly to the side of it, and you tried this now, letting your gaze drift away from the patch of sky you wanted to study so that the dimmer stars would appear in the corner of your vision, tiny points of light that vanished when you turned to face them directly. The constellations moved slowly overhead, not in a way you could perceive from moment to moment, but in a way you could feel, a deep, stately rotation that was the earth itself turning under the fixed dome of the heavens. The North Star hung in its usual place, steady and true, above the masthead, and below it the dipper was tilted at an angle that told you the night was still young. You had learned to read the stars the way a landsman reads a clock, and even though the ship was going nowhere, you still found yourself checking the sky out of habit, noting the positions and the angles and the slow, patient march of the celestial bodies. The watch forward was a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the water, and after a while he shifted his weight and you heard the soft scuff of his foot on the deck, a sound that travelled clearly through the still air. The ship's lanterns were lit now, one at the stern and one at the bow, and their flames burned steady and yellow without a breath of wind to flicker them. The stern lantern cast a pool of warm light on the deck around the wheel, and the glow reached out across the water in a long broken column that stretched toward the horizon and then faded into the dark. You could see the reflection of the flame on the glassy surface, a second flame that burned upside down in the water, and the two flames together looked like an hourglass laid on its side, the light pouring from one to the other, without ever diminishing. The moon had not yet risen, and so the stars had the sky to themselves, their light bright enough to cast faint shadows on the deck, the ropes and the blocks throwing thin, sharp lines across the planks. You could see the shadow of the mainmast lying across the hatch cover, and the shadow of the ratlines on the bulwark, a ladder of dark threads that climbed up into the night. The silence was not complete, because the ship was still speaking in its low private voice, the creaks and groans that had accompanied the day, now sharper and more distinct in the cooler air. The deck planks contracted with small, sudden ticks that came at irregular intervals, and the rigging settled into the cold with soft, sighing sounds that were almost like breathing. The water around the hull made a faint, lapping noise now and then as the ship shifted its weight by some imperceptible degree, a sound so quiet you had to hold your own breath to hear it. But it was there, a reminder that the sea was still present, even if it had grown still. The watch amidships stood up from his place near the mainmast and walked slowly aft to the scuttlebutt, and you heard the dipper clink against the rim of the barrel and then the soft glug of water being poured. He drank, replaced the dipper, and walked back to his post without a word, his bare feet making no sound on the deck. The watch was a time of small, quiet actions like this, each one performed slowly and without any sense of hurry, as if the night itself had asked you to move with deliberation and care. You left the wheel for a moment and walked to the rail to look at the water, and you saw that the sea was beginning to glow with a faint, ghostly light that you had seen before on other calms. The light was a pale blue-green that seemed to come from within the water itself, a phosphorescence that stirred whenever something moved beneath the surface. You could see the outline of the hull where it met the sea, traced in this soft, cold light, and you could see small sparks of brighter glow where tiny creatures were swimming through the dark water. A fish, unseen but felt, darted near the surface and left a trail of blue-green fire behind it that faded slowly, the individual sparks winking out one by one until the darkness closed back over them. You leaned on the rail and watched this cold, silent display, and the beauty of it was so quiet, so undemanding, that it felt like a gift given in secret. The man at the bow had seen it too, and he gave a low whistle, and you heard the man amidships chuckle softly, and then the silence returned. The moon began to rise after an hour or so, a thin crescent that climbed up from the eastern horizon with a slow, deliberate grace. The moon was a sliver of silver, so fine that you could see the dark disk of the unlit portion, a ghost moon held in the arms of the bright one. The light it cast was pale and cool, a milky wash that spread across the water and made the phosphorescence harder to see, but replaced it with a long, shimmering path that ran from the horizon all the way to the ship's side. The path was a series of tiny wavelets that were not wavelets at all, but only variations in the surface tension, invisible in the day, but now revealed by the low angle of the moonlight. The path trembled and shifted as you watched, never still, never the same from one moment to the next, and yet always there, a road of silver that led nowhere and everywhere at once. You thought about the old stories, the tales of moon paths that led to other worlds, and the thought was a pleasant, drifting thing that had no weight and no urgency, just a small curiosity that floated through your mind and then floated away. The watch changed again at midnight, 4 bells ringing out from the forecastle bell, and the sound was deeper in the night, the metal cooled by the air and vibrating at a lower pitch. The men who had been on watch with you gathered their things and went below, their footsteps slow and heavy on the ladder, and the new watch came up with their eyes still soft from sleep, their voices husky and low. You were relieved at the wheel by a man whose face you could not see clearly, just the outline of his shoulders and the glint of moonlight on his eyes, and you murmured the same ritual words that had been murmured to you 4 hours before. You did not go below immediately. Instead, you found a place on the forecastle deck where you had sat the day before, and you settled yourself against the capstan with a blanket wrapped around your shoulders, against the slight chill of the deep night. The moon had climbed higher now, and its light was stronger, casting sharp shadows on the deck and making the white paint of the boats glow like snow. You could see the other members of your watch doing the same as you, finding corners and crannies where they could rest and let the night pass over them, and the ship became a quiet dormitory of half-sleeping men who were still somehow awake, still somehow aware of the world around them. The night air had a different smell from the day air. It was cooler and cleaner, the salt less sharp and the tar less sweet, and it carried a faint, fresh scent that might have been the smell of the open ocean breathing in its sleep. You pulled the blanket tighter and let your head rest against the wood of the capstan, and you looked up at the stars that were now shifted noticeably in their positions, the dipper tilted further and the North Star steady as always. The time passed in a way that was not measured, the minutes dissolving into each other and the hours becoming a single continuous experience of quiet and dark and the gentle presence of the ship around you. At some point you closed your eyes, and the sounds of the night became clearer without sight to distract you. The slow breathing of the man sleeping near the foremast, the distant murmur of the new watch talking softly on the quarterdeck, the creak of the rudder as it stirred in its gudgeons, the sigh of the stays as they cooled, the faint, high-pitched hum of the wind that was not a wind but only the movement of the air through the rigging, a sound so soft it was almost not a sound at all but a feeling, a vibration that you sensed through your skilled yourself. The ship floated on the dark water, and the dark water floated under the stars, and the whole arrangement seemed to have existed forever and to be waiting for something that did not need to arrive. You opened your eyes again and saw that the moon had moved well past its zenith and was now descending toward the west, its light even paler than before, the crescent thinner and sharper against the black. The stars were beginning to fade in the east, where the first hint of dawn was still only a thought, a supple thinning of the darkness that you could not be sure you were seeing or only imagining. The man who had been at the bow came and sat near you, and for a long time neither of you spoke, and then he said in a low voice that he had been watching the night sky for 40 years, and it never got old, and you nodded even though he could not see you nod, and the two of you sat there in the companionable silence of sailors who understood that some things did not need to be talked about. The first true light of dawn began to show itself as a pale grey line along the eastern horizon, a line so fine and so faint that it was more like the absence of darkness than the presence of light. The line widened slowly, becoming a band of grey that shaded into a delicate rose and then into a pale, watery yellow that was the color of the sun before it rose. The stars went out one by one, the dimmest first and then the brighter ones, until only the morning star remained, a single point of brilliance in the growing light. The moon was still visible, but it had become a ghost of itself, a thin, translucent curve that was fading into the blue. The sea began to take on color again, the deep black of the night giving way to the deep blue of the day, and the phosphorescence that had sparkled in the water was gone, replaced by the clean, empty surface that you had been looking at for days. The ship came alive around you in its slow morning way, the men stirring from their corners, the cook's smoke rising from the galley chimney, the boatswain's voice calling out the first orders of the day in a tone that was more of a greeting than a command. You stood up from your place by the capstan and stretched your stiff limbs, feeling the pleasant ache of a night spent half awake under the stars, and you looked once more at the horizon, where the sun was now pushing its first golden edge above the water. The night watch was over, and the day was beginning, and the ship was still resting on the motionless sea, patient and quiet, carrying you all through another rotation of the earth toward whatever lay ahead. The day had begun with the same slow unfolding of light and warmth that you had come to know as the only kind of morning the calm would allow, and by the time the sun was fully clear of the horizon, the cook had already been at work for an hour in his small hot kingdom below the deck. The galley was a cramped space tucked into the forward part of the ship, its brick hearth and iron stove filling the room with a dry, radiating heat that baked the wooden bulkheads and made the air shimmer above the chimney on deck. The cook was a man of middle years with flour permanently dusted into the creases of his knuckles and a quiet, methodical way of moving that turned the preparation of food into a kind of meditation. He rose earlier than anyone except the watch, lit the fire with a handful of oakum and a few chips of dry wood, and then set the great iron kettle over the flames to begin the long, slow process of heating water for the day. The water came from the ship's stores, drawn from the butts that lined the lower hold, and it was measured out by the cook with the same care a goldsmith might measure precious metal, because the captain had made it clear that the calm could last weeks longer and the water must hold out. Every man was allowed a fixed ration each day, a quart for drinking and a small extra amount for washing, and the cook kept a tally of every dipperful on a slate that hung by the chimney. You knew the taste of this water by heart now, the faint woody flavour of the oak cask and the slight flatness that came from being stored for months in the dark, but it was cool enough in the morning to be refreshing, and you had come to look forward to the first dipper of the day as a small private pleasure. The cook prepared the morning meal with the same ingredients he had used every day since the wind had stopped because the ship's provisions were limited and there was no fresh food left to speak of. The main staple was ship's biscuit, a hard pale disk made of flour and water and salt that had been baked so thoroughly it would keep for years without spoiling. The biscuits were stored in great barrels in the hold, and the cook brought up a basket of them each morning, counting them out to make sure each man received his allotment. The biscuit was so hard that you could not bite into it without first softening it, and so the men had developed various methods over the years. Some dipped it into their tea or their grog, others wrapped it in a damp cloth and let it sit, and a few simply sucked on it like a stone until the surface yielded. You preferred to break your biscuit into small pieces and let them rest in your cheek until the moisture of your mouth turned them soft, releasing the bland, slightly salty flavour of flour and the faint nuttiness of the barrel wood. The morning meal also included a cup of weak tea made from leaves that had been boiled so many times they produced only a pale amber colour and a ghost of bitterness. But the warmth of the cup in your hands was a comfort, and the ritual of drinking it slowly while the ship woke up around you had become one of the small anchors of your day. The men gathered near the galley hatch when the cook called out that breakfast was ready, and they stood or sat in their usual spots with their tin plates and cups, their faces still soft from sleep, and their voices low. There was no rush, no jostling for position, just the slow, natural order of men who had been eating together for months and knew each other's habits. You took your place on the hatch cover and set your plate on your knees, and you ate your biscuit and drank your tea while the morning sun climbed higher and the shadows shrank. The meal was over quickly. not because anyone hurried, but because there was so little to eat. And when it was done, you rinsed your cup with a splash of water and wiped your plate with a rag and put them away for the next meal. The morning passed with its usual small tasks and its usual slow rhythms, and by the time the sun was directly overhead, the heat had built to the point where even thinking about food seemed too heavy. The cook had been working through the morning to prepare the noon meal, and the smells from the galley had been drifting up through the hatch for an hour, a rich, savory scent of boiling meat and peas that made your stomach stir even in the heat. The noon meal was the largest meal of the day, though it was still modest by any landsman's measure, and the cook had spent the morning soaking salt beef in fresh water to draw out some of the brine, and then simmering it slowly in a great iron pot with dried peas and a handful of onions that had been saved from the last port. The beef had been packed in salt for months, and even after soaking it was intensely salty, its fibers dense and chewy, but it was also rich with the flavor of the animal itself, a deep, savory taste that filled your mouth and made the peas taste sweeter by contrast. The peas had been dried to hardness and then boiled until they split open and turned into a soft, mealy porridge that absorbed the broth from the beef and took on its color and its richness. The cook ladled the stew into the men's plates one by one, and you carried your share to the shade of the boat skids and ate it slowly, spooning up the peas porridge first and then cutting the beef into small pieces with your knife. The beef was so salty that it made your lips burn slightly, but it was also deeply satisfying, the kind of food that settled in your stomach and made you feel solid and grounded. A small piece of hard bread came with the stew, and you used it to mop up the last of the broth from your plate, chewing the softened bread slowly and letting the flavors blend together on your tongue. The water ration was especially precious at midday because the heat made you thirsty, and the men drank carefully from their cups, taking small sips and holding the water in their mouths before swallowing. Some of the men had saved a portion of their grog ration from the previous evening, a small allowance of rum mixed with water and a little sugar, and they added a splash of it to their drinking water to give it a bit of sharpness. The rum was harsh and fiery, the kind of spirit that sailors had been drinking for centuries, but even a few drops could transform the flat, tepid water into something that felt like a small celebration. You did not drink rum yourself during the day because you found it made the heat feel heavier, but you understood the impulse, the desire for a tiny lift in the middle of the long, still afternoon. After the meal, the men dispersed to their usual resting places, and the ship settled into the midday quiet that was deeper than the quiet of the night because it was full of heat and light, instead of stars and cool air. You sat with your back against the foremast and let your body digest the food, feeling the pleasant heaviness in your limbs and the slow, drowsy drift of your thoughts. A few of the men brought out the small projects they worked on during these idle hours, the personal tasks that had nothing to do with the ship, but everything to do with maintaining a sense of self in the middle of the ocean. One man was mending a shirt that had torn at the shoulder seam, his needle moving in and out of the cloth with a regular, hypnotic rhythm. The shirt was made of coarse linen that had been washed so many times it was soft as flannel, and the man was using a thread of a slightly different color because it was all he had, a pale grey thread on a white shirt, and the mend would be visible, but he did not seem to mind. Another man was carving a small piece of whalebone into the shape of a bird, using a knife that he kept sharp enough to shave with, and the curls of bone that fell onto the deck were thin and translucent like shavings from a block of cheese. He had been working on the bird for days, and it was beginning to take on the suggestion of wings and a tail, the shape still rough, but the intention clear. The old sailor with the anchor tattoo was knitting a sock from yarn he had unraveled from an old sweater, his needles clicking together with a sound like tiny castanets, and the sock grew slowly, row by row, the wool a deep, faded blue that matched the sea on certain afternoons. You had your own small comfort, a piece of hardwood that you had been carving into a new handle for your knife, and you took it out of your sea chest and worked on it during these quiet hours. The wood was a dense, dark piece of lignum vitae that you had found in the carpenter's scrap pile, and it was so hard that your knife left only the shallowest marks with each pass, but the slowness of the work was part of its appeal. You carved a simple pattern of lines around the grip, nothing elaborate, just a series of grooves that would give your fingers purchase when the knife was wet. The smell of the wood was faint and sweet, almost like incense, and it rose up around you as you worked, mixing with the salt of the air and the distant smoke of the galley. The afternoon passed in this way, the small quiet activities filling the hours with their gentle rhythms, the men absorbed in their own worlds, but still together, still part of the same floating household. At the 4th hour of the afternoon, the cook began to prepare the evening meal, which was lighter than the noon meal, but still carried its own small comforts. The evening meal often featured the same ingredients as the earlier meals, but arranged differently. The salt meat sliced cold and served with a pickle of some kind, a relish made from the last of the ship's vinegar, and a few shreds of cabbage that had been fermented in a small crock. The pickle was sharp and sour, and it cut through the saltiness of the meat in a way that woke up your mouth and made the familiar flavors seem new again. Sometimes the cook would make a duff, a dense boiled pudding of flour and suet, and the last of the dried fruit, and on those days the evening meal felt almost festive, the men gathering around with their plates and their small smiles as the cook cut the duff into equal portions and handed them out. The duff was heavy and sweet, the dried fruit providing little bursts of concentrated flavor that were like small treasures hidden in the dough, and you ate it slowly, savoring each bite, knowing that it might be the last duff until the ship reached land and resupplied. The water ration for the evening was the same as the morning, a quart per man, and you drank it in the same careful way, the sips small and measured. The grog ration was served after the meal as the sun was setting, a small cup of rum mixed with water and the squeeze of lime juice if there was any left, and the men gathered on the forecastle to drink it and watch the light fade. The grog was warm and the rum was sharp, and it spread a gentle heat through your chest that was different from the heat of the day, a pleasant inward warmth that loosened the muscles of your shoulders and made your eyelids feel heavy. The talk during these evening hours was easy and rambling, the men recounting the stories of other voyages and other calms, the details shifting slightly with each telling, but the core of the stories always the same. The old sailor told about the time he had been becalmed off the coast of Brazil, and the water had been so clear that you could see the bottom even though it was 100 fathoms down, a claim that no one believed, but everyone enjoyed hearing. The young sailor with the sunburned face told about the meal his mother used to make on feast days, a great roasted bird stuffed with chestnuts and bread, and the description was so vivid that you could almost smell the roasting meat and hear the crackle of the skin. The stories were a kind of food in themselves, feeding the imagination and the memory, and they filled the evening hour with a sense of shared history that went beyond the present voyage. When the grog was gone and the stories had wound down, the men sat in the gathering darkness and listened to the ship's nighttime sounds, the creaks and sighs that had become as familiar as their own breathing. You often took out your piece of lignum vitae again and worked on it by the light of the stern lantern, the tiny curls of wood falling into your lap as you carved, and the work was so absorbing that you would look up and find that an hour had passed without your noticing. The night watch took their places, and the rest of the men went below to their hammocks, and the ship settled into its deep, quiet rhythm. You lay in your hammock with a blanket pulled up to your chin, and the taste of the day's meals was still faint on your tongue, the salt and the pickle and the sweetness of the duff, and you let the memory of those tastes carry you down into sleep. The food and the water and the small handmade things were the threads that held the days together, the routines that gave shape to the formless hours, and they were enough. They were more than enough, because they reminded you that even in the middle of an empty ocean with no wind to push you forward, there was still a quiet richness to be found in the simple act of living, in the sharing of a meal, in the slow creation of something with your hands, in the warmth of a cup and the taste of the sea on your lips. The ship drifted on the still water, and you slept, and the cook's fire was banked for the night, but still glowed softly under its covering of ash, waiting for the morning when the whole gentle cycle would begin again. The 14th morning of the calm arrived looking exactly like the 13 mornings that had come before it, with the same pale light spreading slowly across the same glassy water, and the same soft, warm air settling over the deck like a blanket that had been left out in the sun. You rose from your hammock and went through the familiar motions of the early day, washing your face with the tepid water from your ration, eating your biscuit and drinking your weak tea, and then presenting yourself to the bosun for the morning's tasks. The routine had become so ingrained by now that your body carried it out without much direction from your mind, your hands knowing where to go and what to do, while your thoughts drifted elsewhere. The bosun set you to work on the foremast yard, checking the foot ropes and the stirrups for any signs of chafe, and you climbed the ratlines with the same automatic ease that a bird might fly to a familiar branch. The view from the yard was the same view it had been every day since the wind had died, a perfect circle of blue water stretching to the horizon in every direction, the surface smooth and unbroken except for the faint shimmering line where the sea met the sky. You worked your way out along the yard, your bare feet finding the foot rope without needing to look, and you ran your hands over the heavy hemp lines, feeling for any soft spots or frayed strands. The work was slow and careful, and it occupied the first hours of the morning, while the sun climbed toward its zenith and the heat began to build. It was sometime near the end of the forenoon watch that you first noticed the change. You had descended from the yard and were standing on the deck near the mainmast, drinking a small mouthful of water from your cup, when you saw the captain emerge from his cabin with his telescope under his arm and a particular expression on his face. The captain was a man who rarely showed anything that could be called excitement, but there was a subtle alertness in the way he walked to the quarterdeck rail and raised his glass to the northern horizon that made you stop and look in the same direction. At first you saw nothing different, just the same pale blue sky and the same darker blue water and the same clean, sharp line dividing them. But as you continued to look, narrowing your eyes against the glare, you began to perceive something that had not been there before, a faint smudge of grey on the very edge of the world, so thin and so distant that it might have been a trick of the light or a fatigue of your own vision. You blinked and looked again, and the smudge was still there, a low, dark line that seemed to rest on the horizon like a pencil mark drawn by an unsteady hand. The captain lowered his telescope and stood very still for a moment, his head tilted slightly to one side, and then he called down to the mate in a voice that was carefully neutral, asking him to come up and take a look at something. The mate climbed the ladder to the quarterdeck, and the two of them stood together, passing the telescope back and forth and speaking in low tones that you could not quite hear, but that carried a note of quiet interest. By the time the noon meal was served, word had spread through the ship that there was something on the horizon, something that might be a sign of weather. The men ate their salt beef and peas with their eyes frequently turning to the north, and the talk was more animated than it had been in days, though still low and calm, the talk of men who had learned not to raise their hopes too quickly. The old sailor with the anchor tattoo said that he had seen a sky like that before a change came, a darkening on the horizon that meant a breeze was stirring somewhere far away, and the young sailor asked how long it might take to reach them, and the old man shrugged and said that the weather moved at its own pace and could not be hurried. You finished your meal and found a place near the foremast where you could sit and watch the northern horizon, and you were joined by several of the other men who had the same idea. The dark line was still there, and as the afternoon wore on it seemed to grow slightly more distinct, its edges sharpening from a soft blur into something that looked almost solid. Above the dark line there appeared a thin layer of cloud, a high, pale sheet of cirrus that spread across the northern sky like a veil of silk drawn slowly over the blue. The clouds were so high and so fine that they did not dim the sun, but they changed the quality of the light, making it softer and more diffuse, and the heat that had been pressing down on the ship with such steady weight seemed to ease just a little. The captain spent most of the afternoon on the quarterdeck, his telescope never far from his eye, and he was joined by the mate and the bosun and a few of the older sailors who had spent their lives reading the sky and the sea and had learned to see things that younger men could not. They stood in a loose group near the rail, their voices a low, steady murmur that drifted across the deck without carrying any distinct words, and every now and then one of them would point to something in the clouds or on the water, and the others would nod slowly, their faces thoughtful and patient. You found yourself paying a new kind of attention to the world around you, your eyes moving from the dark line on the horizon to the high, thin clouds and back again, trying to learn what the older men already knew. The clouds were spreading slowly, not moving so much as expanding, their edges feathering out into the blue in long, delicate wisps that looked like the brushstrokes of a painter working in white on a blue ground. The color of the sky was changing too, the pale, washed-out blue of the calm deepening in places to a richer, more layered tone that held hints of grey and lavender. The sea beneath the dark line had taken on a different texture, a slight roughening of the surface that was not yet waves, but was no longer the perfect mirror of the past 2 weeks. You could see the difference most clearly along the horizon, where the sharp division between sea and sky had become slightly blurred, the two elements bleeding into each other in a way that made the distance seem closer and the world feel smaller. The old sailor came and stood beside you, and after a long silence he said that the glass had been falling slowly all day, and that a falling glass was the surest sign of a change in the weather. You asked him what kind of change, and he looked at the sky for a long moment before answering, his eyes moving across the clouds and the dark line and the roughened water as if he were reading a page from a book. He said that it was too early to tell, that it might be a breeze from the north that would fill the sails and push the ship on its way, or it might be nothing at all, a false sign that would fade before the sun went down. The sea, he added, was full of promises that it did not always keep, and the wise sailor learned to watch and wait without letting his hopes climb too high. The afternoon deepened into evening, and the signs continued to develop with the same slow, patient pace. The dark line on the horizon had grown into a band of deeper grey that seemed to rise slightly above the water, and the clouds above it had thickened into a thin, even layer that covered most of the northern sky and was now spreading toward the zenith. The sun, as it began its descent toward the west, passed behind this layer of cloud and emerged on the other side, with its light softened and coloured, the gold of the late afternoon turning to a pale watery yellow that cast long, gentle shadows across the deck. The air itself felt different on your skin, less heavy and less still, though there was still no true wind to speak of, only a faint tentative movement that came from the north and stirred the loose ends of your kerchief before dying away again. The men had gathered on the deck in larger numbers than usual, their evening meal forgotten for the moment as they watched the sky and the sea and talked in low, quiet voices about what the signs might mean. The cook came up from the galley and stood with his arms folded, his face flushed from the heat of the stove, and he looked at the northern horizon and said that he would hold off on preparing the duff until the morning, because if the wind came back the ship would need all hands, and there would be no time for puddings. The captain had taken out his sextant and was measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon, even though the ship had not moved in 2 weeks, and the position was known to within a few miles, and the mate was standing by with the logbook, ready to record whatever the captain might decide to write. As the sun set, the colours in the sky grew more pronounced and more varied. The high, thin clouds caught the last light and turned it into shades of rose and amber and a pale, delicate green that you had only ever seen in calms like this one, a colour that seemed to belong more to the sea than to the sky. The dark band on the horizon had become a solid grey wall that looked almost like a distant shore, and you could see within it the faint vertical streaks that might have been rain falling far away, rain that was evaporating before it could reach the sea, but that spoke of movement and change in the atmosphere. The older sailors watched these signs with quiet, knowing eyes, and they pointed out to the younger men the way the clouds were stacking, the way the light was bending, the way the smell of the air had shifted from the dry, clean salt of the calm to something slightly damper and earthier, as if a door had been opened somewhere far away and a new room of weather was being revealed. You stood at the rail with your hands resting on the warm wood and your face turned toward the north, and you let yourself feel a small, quiet stirring of hope. Not the kind of hope that demanded anything or expected anything, but the kind that simply noted the possibility of change and found it interesting. The ship creaked around you in its familiar voice, and the water lapped against the hull with a slightly more insistent rhythm than it had in days, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath in a different way than before, a breath that might be released in a sigh of wind or might simply be held forever. The night came on and the darkness hid the signs from view, but the men stayed on deck later than usual, reluctant to go below while something might be happening. The stars appeared one by one through the thin layer of cloud, their light slightly diffused and softened, and the moon, which was a few days past its first quarter, cast a pale, milky glow that made the clouds visible even in the dark. The captain ordered the lanterns lit, and their flames flickered slightly in the faint, intermittent breaths of air that came from the north. The first flickering the lantern flames had done since the calm began. You watched the flames closely, holding your own breath each time they wavered, and you felt the small, almost imperceptible touches of moving air on your cheeks and your forehead, touches that were gone almost before you could register them. But that left behind a sense of something stirring. The mate came forward and stood near the bow with the old sailor, and the two of them sniffed the air and held up wet fingers and did all the small instinctive things that sailors had done for centuries to read the invisible movements of the atmosphere. The young sailor asked if the wind was coming back, and the mate said that it might be and it might not be, and the best thing to do was to get some sleep so that there would be strength for whatever the morning brought. The men began to drift below one by one, their voices fading as they descended the ladder, and soon the deck was left to the night watch and the few who could not bring themselves to leave. You stayed on deck for a long time, sitting with your back against the foremast and your blanket wrapped around your shoulders, your eyes fixed on the northern horizon even though you could see nothing there in the darkness. The faint breaths of air continued to come at irregular intervals, each one a small soft touch that made the sails stir in their gear and the ropes tap against the masts, and each time you felt one, you lifted your head and listened, waiting for the sound of a true breeze that never came. The clouds overhead thickened slowly, and the stars began to disappear behind them, the moon fading from a bright crescent to a soft, diffuse glow that lit the whole sky with a pale, even light. The air grew slightly cooler, and the smell of dampness increased, and you could feel a change in the pressure of the atmosphere, a subtle loosening of the weight that had been pressing down on the ship for 2 weeks. But the wind did not come, and the dark band on the horizon did not move any closer, and after a while the breaths of air stopped altogether and the lantern flames burned straight and steady once more. The mate, who had been standing his watch on the quarterdeck, came forward and told you gently that the signs were fading, that the glass had stopped falling and the clouds were beginning to thin, and that it was time to get some rest. You looked at the sky one more time and saw that he was right. The clouds were breaking up in the north, the stars were reappearing through the gaps, and the dark line on the horizon was no longer visible even as a deeper darkness against the night. The hope that had stirred in your chest did not crash or break. It simply settled back into stillness, the way a bird settles back into its nest after a brief restless movement. You rose from your place and went below to your hammock, and the ship was quiet around you, and the water was still, and the calm had returned as fully as if it had never been interrupted. The next morning, clear and bright and hot. The sky a perfect unbroken blue from horizon to horizon. The sea a sheet of polished glass that reflected the sun with an almost blinding intensity. The dark band was gone. The high clouds were gone. The faint breaths of air were gone, and the world looked exactly as it had looked on the first day of the calm, as if the previous day's signs had been nothing more than a shared dream. The men rose and went about their morning routines with the same slow, steady pace they had learned over the past 2 weeks, and the talk was quieter than it had been the day before, though not sad or discouraged, only accepting. The old sailor said that the sea was like that sometimes, that it would show you a door and then close it before you could walk through, and the only thing to do was to go back to waiting and not take it personally. The captain wrote in his logbook with the same careful, unhurried hand, and the bosun assigned the day's tasks with the same calm, even voice, and the cook prepared the noon meal with the same limited ingredients and the same patient skill. You went about your work with a sense of quiet acceptance, and the ship settled back into the rhythm of stillness that had become as familiar as your own heartbeat. The calm stretched on, day after day, and the memory of the weather signs faded into the general texture of the voyage, just another small event in the long, slow passage across the windless sea. You did not stop watching the horizon, because watching the horizon was what sailors did, but you watched it now without any particular expectation, just letting your eyes rest on the clean, distant line where the blue of the sky met the blue of the water. The ship drifted on the still sea and you drifted with it, and the waiting continued, patient and endless and full of its own quiet peace. The third week of the calm arrived without any marker to distinguish it from the second week or the first, the days folding into one another like the pages of a book that had been left open in the rain, the ink of each day bleeding into the next until the individual entries could no longer be read. You had stopped counting the days at some point, not because you had lost track, but because the number no longer seemed to matter. The ship was still floating on the still water, and the sun was still rising and setting with the same slow, predictable rhythm, and the routines of the day were still carrying you from morning to noon to evening, with the gentle, effortless momentum of a leaf drifting on a current. The calm had become not an interruption, but the entire world, a complete and self-contained reality that asked nothing of you except to exist within it, and you had learned to do that with a thoroughness that surprised you when you thought about it. The heat had settled into the very bones of the ship, the deck planks warm even at midnight, and the tar in the seams permanently soft, giving off its sweet, dark smell without ceasing. The air was so heavy with moisture that your shirt never fully dried after you washed it, remaining perpetually damp and clinging to your skin in a way that had become so familiar you no longer noticed it. The water ration had been reduced slightly at the captain's quiet order, not because there was any immediate danger of running out, but because the calm showed no sign of ending, and prudence was a habit that the captain had cultivated over decades at sea, and the men accepted the reduction with the same quiet, unquestioning acceptance that they accepted everything else. Your thoughts had slowed to match the pace of the world around you, the quick, darting movements of the mind that had characterized the first days of the calm, giving way to a long, slow drift that was more like a river moving through a flat plain than a stream tumbling down a hillside. You could sit for an hour or more without thinking anything that could be called a complete thought, your mind simply resting on the surface of the present moment, the way the ship rested on the surface of the sea. When thoughts did come, they were soft and diffuse, not the sharp, directed thinking of a man solving a problem, but the gentle, meandering reflection of a man who had no problems to solve. You remembered other voyages you had taken, other ships you had served on, and the memories rose up out of the stillness like fish swimming up from the deep, their colors clear and vivid for a moment, and then fading back into the general blue. You remembered a particular harbor in the West Indies, where the water was so clear you could see the anchor lying on the bottom 30 feet below, its flukes buried in the white sand, and its stock casting a sharp black shadow. You remembered the sound of a woman singing on a dock in Portsmouth, her voice carrying across the water in the evening while the ships swung at their moorings and the gulls settled down for the night. You remembered the taste of fresh mangoes eaten on a beach in Jamaica, the juice running down your chin and the sweetness so intense it made your teeth ache. These memories did not come with any sense of longing or sadness. They came simply as facts, as pieces of a life that you had lived and that you might live again some day, and they drifted through your mind and then drifted away, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their presence. The ship had become more than a vessel. It had become a kind of monastery, a place where the absence of external events had turned the attention inward and revealed a landscape that was normally hidden by the noise and motion of ordinary life. The other men seemed to be experiencing the same thing, each in his own way. The old sailor with the anchor tattoo had grown quieter than ever, spending long hours sitting on the forecastle with his carving in his hands, but not working on it, just holding it and looking out at the water with an expression of deep, settled peace. The young sailor with the sunburned face had stopped asking questions and had learned to sit still, his restless energy gradually subsiding into a calm that matched the sea. The cook had become almost priestly in his devotion to his small rituals, the measuring of the water and the stirring of the pot and the slicing of the salt meat performed with a slow, deliberate care that made each action seem like a prayer. Even the ship's cat had been affected by the stillness, spending its days stretched out on the warm deck with its eyes half closed, its purring a low, constant hum that blended with the creaking of the timbers and the distant murmur of the men. The silence was no longer an absence of sound but a presence of its own, a thick, living substance that filled the spaces between the masts and the sails in the water, and you moved through it the way you might move through water, slowly and with a kind of reverence. The inner quiet that had settled over you was not the quiet of sleep or the quiet of exhaustion. It was a quiet of acceptance, so complete that it had no edges. You had accepted the calm, accepted the heat, accepted the slow reduction of the water and the endless repetition of the days, and the acceptance had brought with it a strange, unexpected freedom. There was nothing to do and nowhere to go, and because there was nothing to do and nowhere to go, there was nothing to worry about and nothing to strive for. The ambitions and anxieties that had driven you through your ordinary life had faded into the background, and what remained was a simple, present awareness that was its own kind of contentment. You could sit on the deck and watch the sunlight move across the planks, and the watching was enough. You could listen to the creak of the hull and the sigh of the rigging, and the listening was enough. You could feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, and the slight salt roughness of the wood under your hands, and the feeling was enough. The world had shrunk to the size of the ship, and the ship had become a complete universe, a wooden sphere that contained everything you needed: food, water, shelter, companionship, and the endless, patient presence of the sea. The days continued to pass with the same slow, even rhythm, and the deep calm that had settled over the ship seemed to deepen even further as the third week wore on. The heat became more intense, the air heavier and more still, until it felt as though the atmosphere itself had thickened into something almost solid, a warm, wet weight that pressed down on your shoulders and made even the smallest movement feel like an effort. You found yourself moving less and less, spending more and more time in whatever patch of shade you could find, your body settling into the same stillness that had claimed the sea. The other men did the same, and the ship during the hottest parts of the day looked like a painting of a ship, the figures on its deck frozen in place, their limbs relaxed and their faces peaceful. The old sailor had taken to sitting in the shade of the mainmast with his back against the wood, and his eyes closed, and you often sat near him, the two of you sharing the silence without needing to speak. Sometimes he would open his eyes and look at you and give a small, slow nod, and you would nod back, and the exchange felt as full and as satisfying as a long conversation. The young sailor had found a place under the overhang of the quarter-deck where the shade was deepest, and he lay there for hours with his hands folded on his chest and his breathing slow and regular, not sleeping, but resting in a state that was deeper than waking and lighter than sleep. The carpenter's mate had stopped working on his projects altogether, his tools lying unused in their chest, while he sat on the deck and stared at the water with a calm, unfocused gaze that seemed to be looking at something far beyond the horizon. You thought sometimes about what you would do when the wind returned, when the ship began to move again and the routines of sailing reclaimed the days. The thought was not urgent. It came and went like a cloud passing across the sun, and you did not try to hold on to it. You imagined the sound of the wind in the rigging, the feel of the deck tilting under your feet, the sight of the sails filling and drawing, and the images were pleasant but distant, like memories of a place you had visited long ago and might visit again some day but did not need to visit now. The calm had taught you that there was a kind of richness in stillness, a depth that could only be found when the forward motion of life was suspended and the mind was left to explore its own interior spaces. You had never known this kind of stillness before, not on land where there were always things to do and places to go, not on other voyages where the wind had always been present, even when it was light. This calm was different, this calm was absolute, and it had opened a door inside you that you had not known existed. The door led to a room that was quiet and empty and full of light, and you had spent many hours in that room over the past 3 weeks, sitting in its silence and letting its peace settle into your bones. The ship itself seemed to have entered a new phase of its own existence, its creaks and groans becoming less frequent and its movements becoming even more subtle, as if the vessel had accepted the calm as completely as its crew. The deck planks hardly made a sound, the rigging was silent, the rudder did not stir in its gudgeons. The ship floated on the water like a feather on a pond, weightless and motionless, and the water held the ship with a gentleness that was almost maternal, cradling the hull in a grip that was firm but tender. The reflection of the masts and the sails on the glassy surface was so perfect that you could not tell where the ship ended and the reflection began, the two images merging into a single symmetrical shape that seemed to hang suspended in a blue void. The world above and the world below were mirror images of each other, identical in every detail, and the horizon was a circle of light that enclosed them both, a boundary that had no inside or outside because there was nothing beyond it except more of the same. You felt sometimes that you were living in a dream that had no beginning and no end, a dream that was simply there, present and complete and eternal. But the feeling was not frightening, it was comforting, the way a familiar room is comforting, the way a well-worn path is comforting, the way a routine that has been repeated 1,000 times is comforting. The nights were the deepest part of the deep calm, the darkness and the silence combining to create a space that felt outside of time entirely. The stars were the same stars that had been shining since the first night of the calm, and the moon had cycled through its phases and was now a thin, waning crescent that rose late and gave little light, leaving the sky to the stars and the sea to the darkness. You took your watches in the same quiet way you had taken them since the beginning, standing at the useless wheel, or sitting on the forecastle with your blanket wrapped around your shoulders, and the hours passed with a slow liquid flow that could not be measured by any clock. You would learn to read the time by the position of the constellations, and you watched them turn overhead with a sense of companionship, the same stars that had guided sailors across these waters for centuries, the same patterns that had been named by the ancients, and would be named by generations yet to come. The North Star was your particular friend, a steady point of light that never moved while all the other stars circled around it, and you often found your eyes returning to it, drawing a kind of strength from its constancy. The phosphorescence had returned on several nights, spreading across the water in patches of pale blue-green light that glowed and faded and glowed again, and you watched it with the same quiet fascination that you had felt the first time you saw it, the beauty of it undiminished by repetition. One night during the third week, you found yourself alone on the forecastle, the rest of the watch having gone aft to speak with the mate about something that did not require your presence. The ship was so still that you could hear the blood moving in your ears, a soft, rhythmic rushing that was the sound of your own life continuing in the midst of all this stillness. You looked up at the stars and down at the dark water and around at the dim shapes of the masts and the sails, and you felt a sense of peace, so complete that it was almost like joy, though it was a joy that had no excitement in it, a joy that was as calm and as deep as the sea itself. You understood in that moment that this voyage, this calm, this long suspension between one port and the next, was a gift that the sea had given you, a gift of stillness in a world that was always moving. You did not know when the gift would end, and you did not need to know. The present moment was enough, and the present moment was all there was, and you sat with that knowledge and let it fill you the way the water filled the sea. The watch called softly from the quarterdeck that it was time to change over, and you rose and went below to your hammock, and the deep calm closed over you like a blanket, and you slept without dreaming, your body and your mind resting together in the heart of the still, silent, waiting ship. The 27th morning of the calm began like all the others, with the same pale light spreading across the same glassy sea, and the same warm, heavy air settling over the deck like a hand placed gently on a sleeping child's back. You rose from your hammock and went through the familiar motions of the early hour, washing your face with water that was slightly cooler than usual because the night had been marginally less warm, eating your biscuit and drinking your tea while the sun climbed slowly above the eastern horizon. The ship was quiet around you, the men moving with the same slow, deliberate pace that had become the rhythm of their lives, and the water was still the same perfect mirror it had been for nearly a month. There was no sign that this day would be different from any of the others. No cloud on the horizon and no dark band of weather to the north. Just the clean, empty blue of the sky meeting the clean, empty blue of the sea in a circle that enclosed the ship and everything in it. You did your morning tasks with the same calm, automatic attention that you had learned over the past weeks, coiling ropes that were already coiled and checking blocks that needed no adjustment. And the sun rose higher and the heat began to build, and the morning passed into the afternoon with the same slow, seamless flow that all the days of the calm had shared. It was some time in the early afternoon, perhaps an hour after the noon meal, that you noticed the first small change. You were sitting on the foredeck with your back against the windlass, your eyes half closed against the glare of the sun on the water, when something made you open your eyes fully and look toward the port bow. The surface of the sea, which had been a sheet of unbroken glass for as long as you could remember, had developed a slight dark patch about 100 yards from the ship, a subtle roughening of the water that was so small and so faint that you might have imagined it if you had not been looking directly at it. The dark patch spread slowly, not moving across the water, but expanding in place like a drop of ink falling onto wet paper, and as it spread, the surface within it began to show tiny, almost invisible ripples, the kind of ripples that a breath of air might make on a pond. You sat up straighter and shaded your eyes with your hand, and you watched the dark patch with an attention that was entirely calm, the way you might watch a bird land on a distant branch. The patch grew a little larger, and then stopped growing, and the ripples within it faded and disappeared, and the water returned to its glassy stillness as if nothing had happened at all. You continued to watch for a long moment, but the patch did not reappear, and so you settled back against the windlass and let your eyes drift shut again, the small event already fading into the general texture of the afternoon. A quarter of an hour passed, or perhaps half an hour, and then the old sailor, who had been dozing in the shade of the mainmast, lifted his head and sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring slightly as he turned his face first to port and then to starboard. He was a man who had spent more years at sea than you had been alive, and his senses were tuned to things that you could not yet perceive, and when he rose from his place and walked slowly to the port rail, you found yourself rising too, and following him without quite knowing why. The two of you stood at the rail and looked out at the water, and the old man said nothing for a long time, just stared at the sea with his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he were listening to a sound that was too faint for your ears. Then he raised his hand and pointed toward the same patch of water you had been watching before, and you saw that the dark patch had returned, only now it was closer to the ship and slightly larger, a soft, velvety shadow on the surface that spread and contracted with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. Within the shadow the water was rippling, the tiny wavelets catching the light and sending small flashes of silver back toward the ship, and the old sailor let out a long, slow breath and said in his quiet voice that a cat's paw was coming, a breath of wind that might mean something or might mean nothing, but that it was the first breath he had felt in 27 days. The word spread through the ship without any hurry, passed from man to man in the same low voices they always used, and soon a small group had gathered at the port rail, their eyes fixed on the dark patch that was still spreading and contracting out on the water. The mate came forward and stood beside the old sailor, and the two of them exchanged a few quiet words that you did not catch, and then the mate walked aft to the quarter-deck where the captain had appeared with his telescope under his arm. The captain raised the glass to his eye and studied the dark patch for a long time, his face expressionless and his posture as steady as it always was, and when he lowered the telescope he said something to the mate that made the nod slowly and walk to the binnacle to check the compass, though the compass had not been needed in weeks and its needle still drifted aimlessly in its bowl. The dark patch on the water continued to pulse and spread, and now you could see that it was not a single patch but a series of them, a field of small dark cat's paws that were appearing one after another across the port bow, each one a little closer to the ship than the last. The water within the patches was not merely rippled now, but was beginning to show the first faint signs of true wavelets, tiny crests that caught the light and then disappeared, their life so brief and so small that you could only see them if you looked very carefully. The air against your cheek, which had been still and heavy for so many days, stirred slightly and then was still again, and then stirred once more, a soft, cool touch that came from the east and carried with it a faint, fresh smell that was different from the stale, familiar air of the calm. The captain gave a quiet order, and the boatswain roused the men from their resting places and began to assign the tasks that would be needed if the wind continued to build. There was no urgency in his voice, no sharpness, just the same calm, even tone he had used every day of the calm, and the men rose and went to their stations with the same slow, deliberate movements they had learned over the past month. You were sent to the mainmast with a group of others to prepare the sails for trimming, and you climbed the ratlines with your bare feet, finding the familiar holds without any need for thought. The view from the yard was different now. Where before the sea had been a perfect, unbroken mirror, it was now dotted with dark patches that spread and merged and separated again, a slowly shifting pattern that was like watching a field of grass bend under a light breeze. The sails around you, which had hung in their loose, limp folds for so long that they seemed to have forgotten what it felt like to be filled, stirred slightly as you watched, the canvas rippling along its lower edge in a way that you had not seen in nearly a month. The motion was so small that it might have been caused by the movement of the ship alone. But the ship was not moving, not yet. And so the motion must have been the wind, the first true touch of moving air against the heavy cloth. You ran your hand along the sail and felt the canvas shiver under your palm, a faint, rapid vibration that was almost like the beating of a tiny heart, and the sensation was so welcome that you kept your hand there for a long moment, just feeling the return of life to the fabric. The breeze came more steadily now, no longer a series of scattered cat's paws, but a gentle, even flow of air that moved across the water from the east and filled the air with the clean, salt smell of the open sea. The surface of the water had changed completely. The mirror shattered into a field of small, regular wavelets that ran toward the ship in long, parallel lines, and then passed under the hull and continued on toward the west. The ship, which had been motionless for so long that it had seemed to become part of the sea itself, began to respond to the movement of the water, the deck tilting ever so slightly as the hull rose on the first small swell, and the sensation of movement was so strange after all this time that you had to put your hand on the yard to steady yourself. The men on deck below you were moving with a new energy, not a hurried or frantic energy, but a quiet, focused readiness. The kind of readiness that came from months of training and years of experience. The braces were manned, the sheets were ready to be hauled, and the helmsman had taken his place at the wheel that had been useless for so long, his hands resting on the spokes and his eyes on the compass that was now beginning to stir in its bowl. The captain stood on the quarterdeck with his hands clasped behind his back, his face still calm and his voice still low as he gave the orders that would bring the ship back to life. The breeze steadied and strengthened by small degrees, enough to fill the lighter sails if the men were ready, and the boatswain called out to set the topsails and the topgallants. You moved with the other men on the yard, your hands working the gaskets loose and letting the canvas fall free, and the sails dropped from the yards in great, soft folds that hung for a moment and then began to fill. The sound of the canvas taking the wind was a sound you had not heard in so long that it seemed almost new. A deep, soft thump that was followed by the creaking of the blocks and the stretching of the sheets as the sails drew against the brace. The ship leaned slightly to starboard as the wind pressed into the canvas, and the deck tilted just enough that you could feel it through your feet, a gentle, living incline that was the beginning of motion. More sails were set as the breeze continued to hold, the courses and the staysails and the jibs, each one adding its own voice to the growing chorus of sounds that were returning to the ship. The hum of the wind in the rigging, the splash of the bow beginning to push through the small waves, the creak of the rudder as the helmsman turned the wheel and felt the ship answer. The water was no longer a mirror, but a living, moving surface of deep blue that was flecked with the white of small wave crests, and the horizon had become a line that the ship was beginning to cross, the first slow advance toward wherever the wind would take it. The sun was beginning its descent toward the west, by the time all the sails were set and drawing, and the ship was moving through the water with a gentle, steady motion that was like the breathing of a great animal at rest. The speed was not high, no more than a few knots, but after nearly a month of perfect stillness, it felt like flying, the water parting at the bow with a soft, liquid sound, and the wake beginning to stretch out behind the stern in a long, pale ribbon that faded into the distance. You had come down from the yard and were standing on the main deck with your hand on the pinrail, feeling the vibration of the ship's motion through the wood, and the sensation was so pleasant, so deeply satisfying that you closed your eyes for a moment and just let it wash over you. The other men were doing the same, standing or sitting in their places with their faces turned into the breeze and their expressions calm and content. There was no cheering, no shouts of relief or excitement, just the quiet, shared satisfaction of a crew that had waited out the calm and was now being rewarded with the simple, beautiful gift of movement. The old sailor came and stood beside you, his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the horizon ahead. And after a while he said that he had known the wind would come back, that it always came back, and the only thing to do was to wait for it with patience and not to waste the waiting. You nodded and did not speak, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The evening came on with a slow, golden light that made the sails glow like parchment, and the sea sparkle with the last reflections of the sun. The breeze held steady from the east, a gentle, reliable wind that pushed the ship along at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but simply right, the kind of wind that sailors dreamed of when they were beating against a gale or wallowing in a calm. The captain took a sight with his sextant and made a notation in his logbook, the first new entry in weeks, and the mate laid a course on the chart that would take the ship toward its destination, the lines of the course clean and straight across the paper. The men ate their evening meal on deck as they always did, only now the deck was moving gently under them, and the lanterns were swinging slightly on their hooks, casting shifting shadows that danced across the planks. The cook had made a small duff to celebrate the return of the wind, using the last of the dried fruit and a little extra sugar, and the men ate it slowly and appreciatively, the sweetness lingering on their tongues as the stars began to come out in the darkening sky. The night watch took their positions, and the rest of the men went below to their hammocks, and the ship sailed on through the darkness with the wind steady behind it and the water whispering along the hull. You stood your watch that night with your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the compass, and the needle was steady now, pointing the way while the ship moved forward through the gentle swells. The stars were the same stars that had watched over the calm, but they seemed different now, brighter and closer, as if they too were pleased by the return of motion. The sea was dark around you, but it was a friendly darkness, a darkness that held the ship in its hands and carried it forward with a gentleness that was almost tender. You thought about the month that had passed, the long, still days and the deep, quiet nights, and you understood that the calm had been a gift, a time outside of time that had taught you something about stillness and patience and the art of waiting. But you also understood that the wind was a gift too, the movement and the sound and the sense of purpose that came with sailing toward a destination. The two things were not opposed to each other, they were parts of the same whole, the stillness and the motion, the waiting and the going, and a sailor's life was made of both in equal measure. The ship sailed on through the night, and you stood at the wheel and felt the living movement of the vessel under your hands, and the breeze was cool on your face, and the stars were bright overhead, and the sea stretched out ahead in a long, open road that led toward the morning and the days beyond.